I am Gideon Richfield. I'm the editor-in-chief of MIT Technology Review, and welcome to another episode of Radio Corona, our talk show on the coronavirus pandemic and the technological solutions to it. Today, we're going to be talking about digital contact tracing. There's a growing number of contact tracing apps being developed around the world that aim to do digital form of what has manually been done with epidemics for centuries, which is tracing the contacts that people who are infected have had, and then letting those people know that they've been exposed and should quarantine themselves or seek treatment. So the idea of doing this digitally by using an app that can automatically track who you've been in touch with and notify them is something that is new to this pandemic. But how well do these apps work? And what are the privacy implications of all of that monitoring? The good news is there are ways to do this kind of monitoring without necessarily compromising everybody's privacy. And our guest on the show today is one of the leading experts in internet public policy, and is a person who's working on precisely how to do contact tracing for COVID without privacy violations. He's Danny Weitzner, and he is leading a project at MIT called PACT, the Private Automated Contact Tracing. And he'll be talking to us about how it works and what we should and shouldn't expect from coronavirus tracing apps. Also with me is Bobby Johnson, who is one of our editors at Tech Review, and he is in charge of a project that we recently launched called the COVID Tracing Tracker, and that is a database of contact tracing apps all around the world, which ranks them on how good they are at protecting privacy. And he will be telling us about what we found with that project. So, Danny, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Gideon.
And let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about PACT, about this project that you're working on at MIT.
Sure. And by the way, thanks for all your coverage on this issue. I think it's almost this whole new category of both a software product and a public health strategy all wrapped up into one that has developed in the space of really weeks. So I think it's great to have your attention on it. About 10 weeks ago, to be precise, right around the middle of March, Professor Ron Rivest, who's a colleague of mine at MIT and world-leading cryptographer, the R in RSA security, came to me and said, we should try to figure out if there's a way to do privacy-preserving contact tracing. And the motivation for this was that we had seen that in countries where COVID-19 first struck, China, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and a few others, there were very aggressive and seemingly very effective public health strategies deployed against the virus. But part of those strategies included very intrusive surveillance, really, with smartphones and other location information. And I'll say to this day, we don't really know how much those surveillance techniques contributed to the success of the strategies, but the strategies were successful overall. But at the same time, we felt that it really was neither a good idea nor would it likely be acceptable in the US, either in law or in culture, to have that kind of very intrusive surveillance practice deployed. And so we began to look at whether there were other approaches. The key insight that Ron really brought and that we embraced was the view that in order to help do contact tracing for COVID or any other kind of infectious disease, what matters is that you are in proximity with an infected person at some point in time. It doesn't really matter where that proximity event happened. So while a number of the countries that I mentioned were collecting large amounts of location history from smartphones and mobile networks, we felt that we could do the same job just by measuring proximity. And interestingly enough, Ron and a colleague of ours, Yael Kalai, who's a research scientist at Microsoft Research, we're actually teaching the Apple Find My protocol. And any of you who have an iOS device will know that Apple has built this very clever and privacy protective mechanism to help you figure out where you left your iPhone or your iPad. And we realized that you could actually use a lot of that same approach to detect the proximity of two mobile devices. So in the space of about 3 weeks, we got together with colleagues across MIT and from BU and the Weizmann Institute, Brown University, CMU, a number of others, and developed a protocol called the PACT protocol, which uses Bluetooth low energy signals to detect which devices are close to each other. And then when an individual registers him or herself as infected with the virus, it's possible for everyone else in the system to determine in a decentralized way whether they had in the past been close to that individual for a medically significant period of time.
Right. So this is a framework. Is this an actual app that people download on their phones, or is it more like a framework that other apps could
so
Apple and Google?
Right. So we have a kind of a proof of concept app that we play with to test out the protocol. But really, our goal was to develop a protocol and an approach, and then have it adopted by people who are better at building and deploying apps at large scale. Happily, we came out with our proposal on a Wednesday, and Apple and Google announced on that Friday that they were going to get together and do something that was really very similar. We had been in touch with them. In a lot of ways, we all started from similar set of design points, so it's not surprising that we came to a similar set of designs. And really, what Apple and Google have done, as you've covered and your readers know, is they have announced they've built services into the operating system of both iOS and Android that apps will be able to draw on, and the protocol, more or less as I described it, is now implemented in the latest versions of iOS and of Android. And what we're waiting for now is for public health authorities around the world to develop apps to take advantage of those services that are available in iOS and Android.
And I think it's probably worth explaining, and Bobby, feel free to jump in here if you want, but I think we get a lot of interest from people in contact tracing apps, and a lot of people are concerned about privacy and the idea that you're being tracked. And as you pointed out, this Bluetooth system means that your location isn't being collected. But there are also different levels of privacy within that Bluetooth protocol, right? And you can set it up in such a way that also the contact data that you have are not being shared with, for instance, the central authorities. How do you think about that? How important is it for the data to be shared with the government or health authorities versus protecting people's privacy so that, for instance, only your phone notifies other phones that have been near you, but no central authority collects it?
Correct. And look, there's a very careful balance that we all have to strike between protecting the privacy of individuals and making sure that public health authorities have the information that they need in order to successfully contact trace and suppress this virus. The decisions that we made were on the privacy protective side and follow a well-established principle in public health law that really personal information should be collected and used in the least restrictive way possible to achieve a public health goal. The goal of doing contact tracing is very clear and well established. In choosing to a proximity approach as opposed to a GPS location approach, we were following that least restrictive means approach. We've also made sure in our design, and it's largely been picked up in the Apple Google design, that users have complete control over what information they give to whom, and also complete control as to whether they're participating in the system at all. So everyone's device will have this service, but the user, number one, has to choose the app. That's kind of user control step number one. Number two, when a user is notified that they may have been in proximity with someone, they'll be told how to contact a public health authority, but they have to choose to make that contact. And number three, if an individual is infected, they also have to choose to share the information that makes it possible to match up their proximity with others who they came into contact with. There's actually a final level of choice, a fourth level of choice, which interestingly we support, but Apple and Google don't at the moment. We think that if the individual who's a contact gets in touch with public health authorities, they should be able to give the public health authority information that enables the health authority alone to link that contact to the infected individual. Because often what public health authorities have to do to control the disease spread is to identify clusters of disease. That may affect the kinds of instructions they give to individuals who are potential contacts. It also helps them with overall kind of situational awareness of the disease. We provided that can be done. Interestingly, the Google and Apple terms of service prohibit that. So we'll see what happens. It's possible in their technology, but they've actually taken an extra privacy step that we didn't think was necessary or necessarily appropriate, and are really being extra protective.
Okay, so Bobby, you've been using our COVID tracing tracker to look at what apps are doing all around the world. What sort of things are you seeing in terms of what kind of variation is there in the level of privacy protection?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to sort of take a step back to why we started. I think Danny's laid out a really good basis for what's going on, particularly in the US. But, you know, if you look all around the world, there are lots of different automated contact tracing approaches being taken. You know, some countries have a privacy first approach. Some have rolled it out to more people than others. And so we wanted to look at all of that and try and understand what was really going on, what was good practice and bad practice, where people might feel the most threatened or where the most success could be learned from. But what we realized quickly was that there wasn't really a central place to gather all of that information and to look at it in a holistic sense. So we decided to build it ourselves. And I got together with two of our colleagues, Tate Ryan Mosley and Patrick Howell O'Neill, and we started researching and pulling together a long list. Turned out there were hundreds of apps, protocols, initiatives that wanted to be apps but weren't quite yet apps. There was a lot of activity going on. But the deeper we looked in, we realized there was essentially, you know, there were nationally backed or state-backed approaches and apps, and there were ones that weren't, you know. And obviously you can cross the barrier, not be backed by the state and then later be backed by the state. But we decided to track what was going on, you know, that had national backing, whether it launched or not. So that brought us down from a couple of hundred in the COVID tracing tracker down to about 25 to 35 national level apps. And we decided to look at them across all of those things that we've talked about, right? A number of different factors. Is it voluntary? Are there limitations to what the data can be used for? Can it be handed to the police? Can it be used by other government departments or even private institutions? Will the data be destroyed or is it kept indefinitely? Does the app only collect what it says it needs? Or does it go and collect lots and lots of data and then, you know, you have to hope that it's not used for anything? And are the makers transparent about it all? You know, have they got published policies? Is the code open source? And we rate all of these. If a country can prove or an app can prove that it does do these things, then we give it a star. If it's unclear or they definitely do not do this, then it's not awarded a star. So you can look through in your country. You can go and look and see what apps are doing what. And what we found out, you know, as we updated this database, you know, details shift every day, new things happen every day. Readers get in contact with us, and people listening on the call can email us or tweet us or tell us things about the app that they're seeing. But what we're realizing is that there are actually quite different approaches, but there are also very different outcomes. So, for example, you know, most countries are using essentially a Bluetooth-based system that's kind of along the lines that Danny pointed out. But some of them are also doing other things on top. They're also doing GPS tracking. They're also connecting it to other databases of information that the government might already have. And maybe they're handing that off to the police for enforcement on quarantine rules, or they're doing, you know, other kinds of sort of more invasive approach. And then country by country, we found very different outcomes. So Iceland, which is a small country, rolled out its digital contact tracing program very, very early. It was kind of early April, really. But they found out that that wasn't that helpful to them. They got a lot of people using it, but they'd already kept their outbreaks under control largely through manual contact tracing. So they were kind of fast movers, but it hadn't really made that much difference because they'd got good policy in other areas. So it goes exactly to what Danny was saying. It's kind of hard to unpick what the efficacy of some of these things is because there are many things going on at once. But meanwhile, we've seen some countries have a very invasive approach. China, obviously, was the earliest country that there was an outbreak, and they have had a very invasive approach to this, state-controlled, lots of personal information. But it's not just China. There's also countries like Qatar, which has come in for some criticism for having a very invasive approach. They gather up tons and tons of data and essentially tell citizens, you just have to trust us on this one. We're not going to do anything bad with it. Iran launched an app which had some elements of contact tracing. They actually got kicked off Google's App Store because it was, they by all their definitions, it was spyware. So they've had to roll out a different app instead. I think the biggest place we've seen activity in is in India around all of this. So there's been a lot of consternation and uproar and concern around the Indian app, which is called Arogya Setu. Now that works with Bluetooth, but it also tracks location. And unlike many other apps, it's effectively mandatory for millions of people. There are many people whose workplaces demand that you download and use the app in order to go and carry about your business. There are different cities that force citizens to download the app. And if you work for the government, you're supposed to download and use the app. So, so we noted that, and we've been tracking the changes that they made. Now, because of partly what we've reported on the project, but also, what local media and investigators have been looking at, there have been a lot of questions asked of the government and how it's doing this. And they've now said that they're going to make the app open source to make it more transparent and try and essentially sort of comply with some of the better practice on this. But and now we're getting to the stage where I think our biggest challenge is coming up, which is to start tracking efforts across the US states as well. So whereas most countries take a national level approach, we're now seeing in the US it's state by state. So each state is essentially doing it all for themselves. Maybe they're leaning on the Apple Google protocol. Maybe they're using something like Pact is describing. But they're kind of left to fend for themselves somewhat. And so we've got, we might have, 50 plus apps in the US alone that are all trying to do some form of automated contact tracing. So following that is gonna be a big deal. But I think the ground on this is moving really fast. We're seeing data change every day. We're seeing policy shift every day. I mean, as Danny said, this has come together incredibly fast across an incredibly wide swath of people, and and kind of everyone's making it up as they go along because this didn't really exist before.
As we are with the entire pandemic. So I'm just going to remind those watching that you can send in questions for Danny or Bobby or me by writing them into the comments on whatever platform you are watching on, or replying to us on Twitter. And okay, so now let's carry on talking meanwhile about this next phase, which is the rollout of these apps across the US, which Bobby just alluded to. So Danny, talk us a little bit through how you think this is going to play out. Every state, possibly even subgroups within states, will have its own contact tracing app. They'll run on different protocols. How will we get to a situation where data from all of these different apps is being shared in a way that's useful for the public health authorities at a national level?
So let me just offer a tiny bit more context and then answer your question by framing what I think are the two big challenges. The critical bit of context here is that what we're talking about is a digital supplement to a very complicated and nuanced public health investigation process, namely contact tracing. And Apple and Google, I think, got it right in calling their service exposure notification. So it's about the very narrow challenge of identifying who was in proximity to whom in a way that may have been medically significant. The contact tracing process that states are now gearing up and that countries around the world have been gearing up entails very detailed interviews with people who are infected, helping them to make sure they have a way to quarantine themselves, giving them medical advice, trying to elicit from them all their contacts. It's very clear that there are some contacts that a digital system will not identify. People may not have a phone. They might not have the phone on. They may not install the app. They may not trust it. Doesn't matter whether it's required or not. People may have wrapped their phone in aluminum foil for all we know. Digital contact tracing can augment the speed and reach of the contact tracing process overall, which may be really important because we know that there's quite a lot of pre-symptomatic spread of COVID. And so therefore the need to almost reach back in time and find people who you may not even know you were in contact with. The person who's sitting behind you on the bus for 30 minutes may be a relevant contact, but you don't know that person's name, most likely. So there's a role here, but it's got to be part of a larger manual contact tracing effort, which as Bobby has said, is just in the process of being scaled up. Massachusetts is hiring 1,000 contact tracers. California says they're going to have 10,000. There's some estimates that the entire United States needs between 100,000 and 300,000. That's a whole lot of people and a whole lot of training for a job that's recognized as a sensitive, complicated job. Here are the challenges that I think we face going forward. As Bobby said, each state is likely going to develop its own app to either sit on top of the Google Apple infrastructure or somehow do their own thing. For the Google Apple apps, there's still an unanswered question about how accurate the proximity measures are. There are a number of cases that we've looked at where it seems to be only accurate to within maybe 100 feet. And that's completely inadequate for contact tracing. That's because of the way Bluetooth signals travel. We're actually experimenting with alternatives to that, ways to supplement the proximity measurement with other information that's on the phone, maybe even with ultrasonics. So there is a technical challenge that's going to have to be answered, not surprisingly, as with any new app. The big challenge is to figure out whether this is actually going to be a useful addition to the manual contact tracing process. On the one hand, we know from early reports from even very well-established contact tracing systems in Germany and around the US. Germany, they think they're missing about half the contacts. In Massachusetts, the current reports are that only 50 to 60% of the people return phone calls from contact tracers. So we know we're missing a lot of people. The question is, can these apps supplement that? And final thing I'll say on this is one of the things that we've learned that's really been impressed on us by people who we work with in public health is that the right way to think about these services is almost as if they're medical devices that we should subject to both safety and efficacy tests before we actually deploy them widely to the entire population. On the one hand, we felt, and I think Apple and Google felt, and some of the other efforts around the world, DT3P and others, felt that we had to move really quickly to make it possible to have these tools available. But now that we've rushed to get the technology baseline in place, I think we have some careful work to do to really make sure that the tools are working correctly and that they're adding public health value in a provable way.
Thanks. So I'm getting a few questions from people watching. So one is maybe kind of a really basic question, but it's an interesting one. Why is there not in the US a national initiative to find the best solution for contact tracing and roll it out nationally? Should there be one?
That's a great question. I mean, you could ask the same question about things like voting, where there are big security and implementation challenges. You could ask that about a lot of things in the U.S. In the United States, traditionally, public health has fundamentally been a state-level function. The CDC does a lot of really important things, but when it comes to things like contact tracing, generally what they do is they coordinate state efforts and provide guidance. I think from a pure product perspective, we should look at this period of time as the kind of product market fit moment in the development of this product life cycle. It would be great if we could, snap our fingers and say, okay, here's a perfect app. It works perfectly well. It does everything that public health authorities need. Users trust it. All these things. That would be great. But no app gets to 100% perfection or deployment without going through iterations. So I think we just have to accept that there are going to be different state efforts that are going to try somewhat different designs and have different experiences. Hopefully they learn from each other. A big part of what we're doing at PACT is to be in touch with a lot of state public health authorities, talk with them about how to test and design these services. But there's a lot of learning that needs to be done. I would hope that eventually the CDC can come in and provide guidance and standards in the way that they do on a lot of other issues. But it is going to be a chaotic process for a while.
Yeah. Another question that we're getting is, what's the role of GDPR, the European data privacy regulation, in this whole conversation?
It's a great question, and this actually reveals, I think, the kind of subtlety in a lot of ways of the GDPR approach to privacy, in that there are some limits to how the GDPR applies, because this is a kind of a national level public health function, but it does apply in general. And interestingly, different European countries have chosen different approaches, as Bobby suggested. Some have taken a more centralized approach, the UK, France, Belgium, and a few others. So they've decided to take a lot of the information directly into government systems and then disperse out what they think people need. That's acceptable under the GDPR, provided the governments follow appropriate safeguards and limit the usage of the information to just public health purposes. Other countries, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Austria, have taken the more decentralized approach. That was spurred on in part by a group in Switzerland called DT3P, a great group of cryptographers from university in Switzerland, and I think that they've decided to take a more privacy protective approach, but neither one has any claim on being better in any respect under the GDPR yet. Both centralized and decentralized approaches are possible.
Can you, Danny, I just wondered if you could quickly explain, because some of the viewers have asked about DP3T versus Apple, Google, and you mentioned the difference with PACT as well. Yeah. What's the fundamental difference between these, different protocols?
So there are some really subtle technical differences, and all of the designs are evolving. But fundamentally, they're a very similar architecture. They're all based on Bluetooth proximity detection as opposed to GPS location tracking. They're all quite user-centric. They depend on the user deciding to share information with public health authorities, and then go from there. So they're really much more similar than anything else. DT3P is just announced today, I think, a first pilot project with the Swiss Army and some public health authorities in Switzerland. So I think that'll be quite important for everyone to watch.
I remember when we first started talking about digital contact tracing apps, I guess it must have been or 3 months ago, when the idea was first circulating, I, like a lot of people, thought, okay, these are, we'll roll these out and then they will just track everywhere the epidemic goes and they'll solve the problem. And it's obviously become clear that they're not a substitute for manual contact tracing, as you've been saying, and that there's a whole lot that can go wrong, and there's a whole lot that they depend on to work. But how, if things go well, if they're rolled out and implemented reasonably widely, if the privacy problems are overcome, how big a difference do you think they ultimately will make to slowing the spread of the pandemic?
There are all sorts of very fancy models about this, and the answer is everything from no difference whatsoever to absolutely essential. You can't live without them from a disease suppression perspective. And I think the honest answer is we do not know yet. We're going to have to see how they are. See if we can get them to be accurate enough, which I think we can. We're going to have to see how the manual contact tracing systems integrate them. There are issues both about the risk of kind of over notification that could overwhelm a manual contact tracing system and kind of freak people out. There are issues about under notification. You might miss a lot of people if you get the measurement wrong. And look, the underlying metrics of contact tracing overall are still a work in progress. We all think about this, the CDC standard of proximity within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes. No one knows if that's actually the standard that we should be applying. It's a good estimate based on what's understood about the spread of other similar viruses and what's known about aerosols and droplets and things like that. So this is all a very empirical process, and we have very little data to go on so far. I think that in 6 months we'll know a whole lot more. There's very impressive level of research going on really all around the world that's looking at the characteristics of different kinds of cases, different kinds of contact tracing strategies, and we'll be able to answer, epidemiologists will be able to answer your question, I think, a lot better 6 months from now. But I think if anyone offered an answer today, it would just be a guess.
I wonder, Danny, you worked in the Obama White House on digital privacy. And I mean, obviously, we're at this point, as you say, we're at this point where we're asking people, or people are being asked to sort of trust that the system will eventually improve enough that this will make a big difference. But we don't know how quickly it will get there, and we don't know how well it will act in the in-between phase. And what we've heard a lot from readers is they're worried about that stage between the two. What am I giving away now, and how will it come back later on? Even if we assume that we'll get somewhere good in the end, that seems like an unusual situation for any product to be in. So I wondered, really, I mean, the question seems to be, for many people, I think, is whether it's possible to truly conduct health surveillance while also protecting privacy and making people feel confident in that process along the way. It just seems like a very difficult triangle.
It's a great question, and we're at this exceptional moment without a doubt. We know a lot, though, I would say, about the difference between a well-managed privacy and security strategy and a poorly managed one, about a high-risk strategy versus a low-risk strategy. I think that we know that it's essential to have chief privacy officers who are looking over the handling of any personal information. We know that it's essential to have careful audits of the way systems work. We know that it's essential to have outside oversight. I think public health starts off with a quite high level of trust. And I suppose the challenge here for public health in a lot of ways is to maintain that level of trust. And a lot of that is going to come down to very human things like, how well are these armies of contact tracers trained? Are they encouraged to be discreet? And I guess I would also say that it's going to be so important, I think, to be transparent with the population of any country about just what's happening and what's known, moment to moment about what's working and what's not. It's pretty extraordinary in the U.S. and around the world that the high proportion of populations that have put their trust in governments and followed social distancing and isolation guidelines. I think the three of us sitting here would never have predicted this. I certainly would never have predicted that the U.S. would all of a sudden, essentially voluntarily, under the guidance of state governors, really mostly, would just shut ourselves down. And so I think we are prepared as a society to act with a collective vision and a collective sense of trust. What we know about privacy, though, is that it's very easy to lose it quickly and then extraordinarily hard to recover it. So, it's part of why we started with the most privacy preserving approach we could figure out on the technical side. But really, that's only the beginning. The ultimate question is, are the institutions, namely the public health authorities that are asking for people's trust, going to earn it? I think Apple and Google made the right decision, by the way, in saying that only apps that are issued by state public health authorities in the U.S. Can use the Google Apple facilities at all, because we have to be clear about who we're trusting if we're going to have any kind of coherent sense of privacy here at all.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. I mean, this conversation, many others that I've had, kind of convinced me that there are lots of people who are thinking really hard about how to make these apps trustworthy and safe, but they have to overcome a lot of public distrust and a lot of fear about the ways in which they might be misused or might not be as safe as they claim to be. On that note, I'm going to wrap it up, but thank you very, very much, Dan Weitzman, for joining us, and thank you, Bob, as well. It was great having you on the show. If you're tuning in, thank you for watching Radio Corona, and come back to our website, technologyreview.com, for more episodes and also for video of this show. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.